The age of Jefferson, 1800 to 1816. In the election of 1800, there had been animosity and bitter partisan feeling between two national political parties. Following this revolution of 1800, Thomas Jefferson, the new president, recognized a need for smooth and peaceful transition from the Federalists to the Democratic Republicans. That is why, in his inaugural address of 1801, Jefferson stressed the popular acceptance of all the basic principles of the constitutional government when he stated, "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." By 1816, Jefferson's call for unity seems to have been realized. The Federalists had nearly disappeared, but the Democratic Republicans had adopted many of the positions. Under Jefferson and his close friend, James Madison, the nation experienced peaceful political change, expanded territorially, survived another war, and strengthened its democratic and nationalistic spirit. It was thriving even if it faced significant problems, including slavery, the treatment of American Indians, and loyalty to interest. So that paragraph kind of discusses the rise of the Democratic Republican Party as well as the fall of the Federalist Party. Jefferson's presidency. During his first term, Jefferson attempted to win the allegiance and trust of Federalist opponents by maintaining the national bank and debt repayment plan of Hamilton. In his foreign policy, he carried on the neutrality policies of Washington and Adams. At the same time, Jefferson treated the loyalty of the Democratic Republican supporters by adhering to his party's guiding principle of limited central government. He reduced the size of the military, eliminated a number of federal jobs, repealed the excise taxes, including those on whiskey, and lowered the national debt. Only Republicans were named to his cabinet, as he thought to avoid the internal divisions that distracted Washington. Compared to Adams' troubled administration, Jefferson's first 4 years in office were relatively free of discord. The single most important achievement of those years were the acquisition by the vast western lands known as the Louisiana Territory. So, Jefferson's presidency, one thing you want to understand is the first 4 years he definitely went ahead and he gained the allegiance of the Federalist opponents. He kept the national bank, which, remember, Jefferson was actually against, and he would also keep Hamilton's debt repayment plan. So although that he was a Democratic Republican, you want to understand is that he did try to, at the same time, meet the things, be the middleman. He wanted to meet some of the things the Federalist candidates and the Federalist Party stood for as well. The Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Territory encompassed a large and largely unexplored tract of western land through which the Mississippi and Missouri rivers followed. At the mouth of the Mississippi lay the territory's most valuable property in terms of commerce, the port of New Orleans. For many years, Louisiana and New Orleans had been claimed by Spain, but in 1800, a French military political leader, Napoleon Bonaparte, secretly forced Spain to give the Louisiana Territory back to its former owner, France. Napoleon hoped to restore the French in the Americas. By 1803, however, Napoleon had lost interest in his plan for two reasons. Number one, he needed to concentrate French resources on fighting England, and also there was a rebellion by Toussaint Louverture against French rule in the island of Santo Domingo, and this would lead to a lot of French losses. So Louisiana Purchase, obviously Spain would end up giving that land back to the French. The port of New Orleans is very important because it leads access to the Mississippi River from the ocean. So Napoleon's going to sell this to us. U.S. interest in the Mississippi River. During Jefferson's presidency, the western frontier extended beyond Ohio and Kentucky into the Indiana Territory. Settlers in this region depended for their economic existence on transporting goods on rivers that flowed westward into the Mississippi and southward as far as New Orleans. They were greatly alarmed there when in 1802, Spanish officials who were still in charge of New Orleans closed the port to Americans. They revoked the right of deposit granted in the Pinckney Treaty of 1795, which allowed farmers tax-free use of the port. People on the frontier clamored for government action. In addition, for being concerned about the economic impact of the closing of New Orleans, Jefferson was troubled by its consequences on foreign policy. He feared that so long as foreign power controlled the river at New Orleans, the United States risked entanglement in European affairs. So the Spanish originally had given us free access to the port of New Orleans, which was great. Like I said, access to the Mississippi River was essential for American trade. Well, this is no longer happening. and Jefferson is very concerned about this. So negotiations. Jefferson sent dogs going wild. Negotiations. Jefferson sent ministers to France with instructions to offer up to $10 million for both New Orleans and a strip of land extending from that port eastward to Florida. If the American ministers failed in their negotiations with the French, they were instructed to begin discussions with Britain for a U.S.-British alliance. Napoleon's ministers, seeking funds for a war against Britain, offered to sell not only New Orleans but also the entire Louisiana territory for $15 million. The surprised American ministers quickly went beyond their instructions and accepted. So all in all, Napoleon goes ahead and he sells the Louisiana territory for $10 million. We threaten for a British alliance. Right? This is successful. However, there is a constitutional issue. Jefferson and most Americans strongly approved the Louisiana Purchase. Nevertheless, a constitutional problem troubled the president. Jefferson was committed to a strict interpretation of the Constitution and rejected Hamilton's argument that certain powers were implied. No clause in the Constitution explicitly stated that a president could purchase foreign land. In this case, Jefferson determined to set aside his idealism for the country's good. He submitted the purchase agreement to the Senate, arguing that lands can be added to the United States in application of the president's power to make treaties. Casting aside the criticism of Federalist senators, the Republican majority in the Senate quickly ratified the purchase. So in order to make this purchase, you need to look at the Constitution. The Constitution said nothing of whether or not the president had the power to authorize purchase of land. It just wasn't stated. Alexander Hamilton, he was a Federalist. He would argue that there was a loose interpretation of the Constitution. If it doesn't say it, you can go ahead and do it. On the flip side, you're looking at Democratic Republicans and Jefferson. They were advocating for a strong interpretation. They were saying that, hey, if the Constitution doesn't say it, that means you can't do it, right? And the reason why they want a strict interpretation is because, remember, the Democratic Republicans don't want a lot of government power. However, Jefferson's kind of hypocritical here, because what he ends up doing is he ends up going for loose interpretation and buys the land anyways. Consequences. The Louisiana Purchase more than doubled the size of the United States. He went ahead and, he, whatever you want to consider Louisiana Purchase, removed a European presence from the nation's borders and extended the western frontier to lands beyond the Mississippi. Furthermore, the acquisition of millions of acres of land strengthened Jefferson's hopes that his country's future would be based on an agrarian society of independent farmers rather than Hamilton's vision of an urban industrial society. In the political terms, the Louisiana Purchase increased Jefferson's popularity and showed the Federalists a weak, sectionalist party that could do little more than complain about the Democratic Republican policies. So all in all, it gets European control out of North America, or out of specifically here, United States of America. Very important to understand. Lewis and Clark expedition. Even before Louisiana was purchased, Jefferson had persuaded Congress to fund the scientific exploration of the Mississippi West to be led by Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark. Louisiana Purchase greatly increased the importance of the expedition. Lewis and Clark set out from St. Louis in 1804, crossed the Rockies, reached the Oregon coast on the Pacific Ocean, and turned back and completed the journey in 1806. The benefits of the expedition were many: greater geographic and scientific knowledge of the region, stronger U.S. claims to the Oregon Territory, better relations with American Indians, and more accurate maps and land routes for fur trappers and future settlers. It's very important. The Lewis and Clark expedition, they're both sent out before the Louisiana Purchase. These two individuals give us a lot of information of what's westward in the new territory that's purchased. John Marshall and the Supreme Court. After the sweeping Democratic-Republican victory of 1800, the only power remaining to the Federalists was the control of the Supreme Court. The Federalist appointments of the courts, previously made by Washington and Adams, were subject to recall or removal except by impeachment. Federalist judges therefore continued to Washington, to much to the annoyance of the Democratic-Republican Jefferson. So at this point, you're looking at Congress was Democratic-Republican. The president, Jefferson, was Democratic-Republican. So Federalists, all they have is the Supreme Court, and they want to make sure they maintain that. John Marshall, ironically, the Federalist judge who caused Jefferson the most grief, was one of his cousins from Virginia, John Marshall. Marshall had been appointed Chief Justice of the Supreme Court during the final months of John Adams' presidency. He held his post for 34 years. In this time, he exerted a strong influence on the Supreme Court as Washington exerted on the presidency. Marshall's decisions in many landmark cases generally strengthened the central government, often at the expense of states' rights. Very important one is Marbury versus Madison. The first major case decided upon Marshall put him in direct conflict with President Jefferson. Upon taking office, President Jefferson wanted to block the Federalist judges appointed by his predecessor, John Adams. So remember, John Adams went ahead before he left. He wanted to go ahead and assign all these Supreme Court judges that were Federalist. Jefferson wants to go ahead and block these, right, because it's going to give the Federalists more power. And he doesn't want that to happen. He ordered Secretary of State James Madison not to deliver the commissions to those Federalist judges, which means that they won't become judges. One of Adams' midnight appointments, William Marbury, sued for his commission. The case of Marbury versus Madison went to the Supreme Court in 1803. Marshall ruled that Marbury had a right to his commission according to the Judiciary Act in 1789. However, Marshall said that the Judiciary Act of 1789 had given the court great power, greater power than the Constitution allowed. Therefore, the law was unconstitutional, and Marbury would not receive his commission. In effect, Marshall sacrificed what would have been a smaller Federalist gain for a much larger, long-term judicial victory. By ruling a law of Congress to be unconstitutional, Congress established the doctrine of judicial review. From this point on, the Supreme Court would exercise the power to decide whether or not an act of Congress of the President was allowed by the Constitution. The Supreme Court could now overrule actions of the two branches of the federal government. So what this goes ahead and does, big picture, as Marbury versus Madison says, the Supreme Court has the right to go ahead and rule whether or not the president as well as the Congress's decisions are constitutional. Right? That is the power of what they have. Judicial impeachments. Jefferson tried other methods for overturning past Federalist measures and appointments. Soon after entering the office, he suspended the Alien Sedition Acts and released those jailed under them. Remember, Alien Sedition Acts, anyone that spoke negatively against John Adams would be jailed, right, during the time we almost went to war with France. Hoping to remove partisan federal judges, Jefferson supported a campaign of impeachment. The judge of one federal district was found to be mentally unbalanced. The House had voted his impeachment, and the Senate then voted to remove him. The House also impeached a Supreme Court Justice, Samuel Chase, but the Senate acquitted him after finding no evidence of high crimes. Except for these two cases, the impeachment campaign was largely a failure, and almost all Federalist judges remained in office. So the threat of impeachment caused the judges to be more cautious and less partisan in their decisions. The big picture of Jefferson trying to get these judges impeached doesn't happen. However, the threat of impeachment makes them less partisan and more concerned about making sure decisions they make are what's best for America and follow the Constitution. In 1804, Jefferson won the re-election by an overwhelmingly margin, receiving all but 14 of the 176 electoral votes. His second term was marked by growing difficulties. There were plots by his former vice president, Aaron Burr, opposition of his own, by a faction of his own party, the Quids, who accused him of abandoning democratic Republican principles, and foreign troubles from the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. So we're seeing threats here from Aaron Burr. So we'll talk about Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr, a Democratic Republican Democratic Republican caucus in 1804 decided not to nominate Aaron Burr for a second term as vice president. Burr then embarked on a series of ventures, one of which threatened to break up the Union, and another in which resulted in the death of Alexander Hamilton. So Burr, of course, tries to backstab America, and at the same time, he also kills Alexander Hamilton. Here's a conspiracy. Secretly forming a political pact with some radical New England Federalists, Burr planned to win the governorship of New York in 1804. Unite that state with the New England states, and then lead his group of states to secede from the Union. Most Federalists followed Alexander Hamilton in opposing Burr, who was defeated in the New York election. The conspiracy was then disintegrated. So what Burr wanted to do is he wanted to win. He wanted to go ahead and just win the governorship of New York, and he was going to go ahead and get all these states to band together, secede, and then go to war with the United States. Well, he's a failure. He loses. Angered by an insulting remark attributed to Hamilton, Burr challenged the Federalist leader to a duel and fatally shot him. Hamilton's death in 1804 deprived the Federalists of their last great leader and earned Burr the enmity of many. So Aaron Burr kills Hamilton, and this would be the last of the strong leadership of the Federalist Party. Trial for treason. By 1806, Burr's intrigues had turned westward with a plan to take Mexico from Spain and possibly unite it with Louisiana under his rule. Learning of his conspiracy, Jefferson ordered Burr's arrest and trial for treason. Presiding at the trial was Chief Justice of Supreme Court John Marshall, a longtime adversary of Jefferson. A jury acquitted Burr, basing its decisions on Marshall's narrow definition of treason, the lack of witnesses to any overt act by Burr. So they try to get Burr guilty of treason. It doesn't happen. They don't have that concrete evidence. Difficulties abroad. As a matter of fact, policy and principle, Jefferson tried to avoid war. Rejecting government alliances, he sought to maintain U.S. neutrality despite increasing provocations from both France and Britain during the Napoleonic Wars. The Barbary pirates. The first major challenge to Jefferson's policy came not from major European power, but from the piracy practiced on the Barbary states of the North African coast. To protect U.S. merchants from being seized by Barbary pirates, President Washington Adams had reluctantly agreed to pay tribute, meaning they're going to go ahead and pay money to the Barbary governments. The ruler of Tripoli demanded a higher sum in a tribute from Jefferson. Jefferson doesn't want to pay this, and he sends a small fleet of the U.S. Navy to the Mediterranean. Sporadic fighting with the Tripoli lasted for 4 years. Although the American Navy did not achieve a decisive victory, it did gain some respect and also offered a measure of protection to U.S. vessels trading in Mediterranean waters. So Jefferson goes ahead and he doesn't want to pay these taxes or tributes. So he formulates the Navy or he strengthens the Navy. This earns it some respect. We also get some challenges to U.S. neutrality. A couple examples of this would be the Napoleonic Wars continue to dominate the politics of Europe and to shape the commercial economy of the United States. The two principal belligerents, people in war, were France and Britain, and they attempted naval blockades on enemy ports, so they would block U.S. trade. They regularly seized the ships of neutral nations and confiscated their cargoes. The chief offender of the U.S. Point of view was Britain. Since its navy dominated the Atlantic, most infuriating was the British practice of capturing U.S. sailors, which we talked about, impressing, and they would serve in the British Navy. So that was a challenge. Both the French and the British were doing this. They were blocking our trade and also kidnapping our merchants. Chesapeake Leopold affair. One incident at sea especially aroused American anger and almost led to war. In 1807, only a few miles off the coast of Virginia, the Britain warship, the Leopard, fired on the U.S. warship, the Chesapeake. 3 Americans were killed and 4 others were taken captive and oppressed in the British Navy. Anti-British feeling ran high, and many Americans demanded war. Jefferson, however, resorted to diplomacy and economic pressure in his response to the crisis. So we're getting Americans that are killed when a British warship attacks an American warship, right? We're at this point where we really want to go to war. But instead, what we end up doing is we end up passing the Embargo Act of 1807. As an alternative to war, Jefferson persuaded the Democratic majority in Congress to pass the Embargo Act in 1807. This measure prohibited American merchant ships from sailing to any foreign port. Since the United States was Britain's largest trading partner, Jefferson hoped that the British would stop violating their rights of neutral nations rather than lose trade. The embargo, however, backfired and brought greater economic hardship to the United States and Britain. The British were determined to control the seas at all costs, and they had little difficulty substituting supplies from South American for U.S. goods. The embargo's effect on the U.S. economy, however, was devastating, especially for the merchant marine and shipbuilders in New England. So bad was the depression that a movement developed in New England states to secede from the Union. Recognizing that the Embargo Act had failed, Jefferson called for repeal in 1809 during the final days of his presidency. Even after repeal, however, the U.S. ships could trade legally with all nations except Britain and France. So, in order to deal with this issue between Britain and France impressing and taking over merchant ships, he passes the embargo of 1807, which says, guess what? You can't trade, right? He stops trade. He's preventing sending of ships to any foreign port. This kills our economy. So many people are so unhappy about this, shipbuilders in New England, that they go ahead and they actually threaten to leave the Union. Jefferson goes ahead and he ends up repealing this, and he opens up trade with other nations except Britain and France. Madison's presidency. Jefferson believed strongly in the precedent set by Washington. of involuntarily retiring from the presidency after a second term. For his party's nomination, the president he supported was his close friend, Secretary of State James Madison. The election of 1808, ever since leading to the effort to write and ratify the Constitution, Madison was widely viewed as a brilliant thinker. He had worked tirelessly with Jefferson in developing the Democratic Republican Party. On the other hand, he was a weak public speaker, possessed a stubborn temperament, and lacked Jefferson's political skills. With Jefferson's backing, Madison was nominated for president by a caucus of congressional Democratic Republicans. Other factions of the Democratic Republican Party nominated two other candidates. Even so, Madison was able to win a majority of electoral votes and to defeat his Democratic Republicans and opponent candidates, Charles Pickney. Nevertheless, the Federalists managed to gain seats in Congress as a result of the widespread unhappiness with the effects of the embargo. Commercial warfare. Madison's presidency was dominated by the same European problems that plagued Jefferson's second term. Like Jefferson, he attempted a combination of diplomacy and economic pressure to deal with Napoleonic wars. Unlike Jefferson, he had finally consented the United States to war. So, big picture, these last few paragraphs, Jefferson ends up after stopping his presidency after 2 terms, follows Washington, as an example, and then we get Madison that ends up being elected president. He's a lot less charismatic. He doesn't have as much political experience. He's not necessarily the best speaker. He's a huge difference because he ends up actually declaring a war against Great Britain in order to deal with those Napoleonic wars. So one of the things that he passes is the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809. After the repeal of Jefferson's disastrous Embargo Act, Madison hoped to end economic hardship while maintaining his country's rights as a neutral nation. The Non-Intercourse Act of 1809 provided Americans could now trade with all nations except Britain and France. He also passes the Macon's Bill No. 2, right? Because this would be Macon's Bill No. 1. Economic hardships continued in 1810. Nathaniel Macon, a member of Congress, introduced a bill that restored U.S. trade with Britain and France. Macon's Bill No. 2 provided, however, that if either Britain and France formally agreed to respect U.S. neutral rights at sea, then the United States would prohibit trade with the nation's foe. So think about it like this. Macon's No. 1, I apologize, let me correct myself, said that we'll trade with Great Britain and France once again. However, the main difference is whoever agrees to respect us and our right to sea first, we'll go ahead and not trade with the other ones. So if Britain respects us, then we'll stop trading with France. Napoleon's deception. Upon hearing of Congress's action, Napoleon announced his intention of revoking decrees that had violated U.S. rights. Taking Napoleon at his word, Madison carried out the terms of Macon's Bill No. 2 by embargoing U.S. trade with Britain. However, he soon realized Napoleon had no intention of fulfilling his promise. He fooled us. The French continued to seize American merchant ships. So, James Madison's fooled by Napoleon. Napoleon's all like, hey, we'll respect your right to trade. So we stopped trading with Britain. Napoleon had no intent to follow that, but this is going to lead to the War of 1812. Neither Britain nor the United States wanted their dispute to end war, and yet war between did not break out in 1812. From the U.S. point of view, the pressures leading to war came from 2 directions: the continued violation of U.S. neutral rights at sea and troubles with the British on the Western Front. Free seas and free trade. As a trading nation, the United States depended upon the free flow of shipping across the Atlantic. Yet the cheap belligerents in Europe, Britain, and France had no interest in respecting neutral rights, so long as they were blocked in life and death struggle with each other. They well remembered that Britain had seemed a cruel enemy during the American Revolution, and the French had supported the colonists. In addition, Jeffersonian Republicans applauded the French for having overthrown their monarchy in their own revolution. Moreover, even though both the French and the British violated U.S. neutral rights, the British violations were worse because the British navies practiced on impressing American sailors. So we hated the British because of impressment, as well as because they're giving a lot of money and a lot of weapons to the Native Americans, as you'll see here, to attack the United States. Added to the long-standing grievances over British actions at sea were ambitions of Western Americans for more open land. Americans on the frontier longed for the lands of the British Canada and Spanish Florida, standing in the way were the British and their Indian and Spanish allies. Conflicts with the American Indians was a perennial problem for restless Westerners. For decades, settlers had been gradually pushing the American Indians further and further westward. In an effort to defend their lands from further encroachment, Shawnee brothers, Tecumseh, a warrior, and the prophet, a religious leader, attempted to unite all the tribes east of the Mississippi River. White settlers became suspicious of Tecumseh and persuaded the governor of the Indiana Territory, General William Henry Harrison, to take aggressive action. In the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1801, William Henry Harrison destroyed the Shawnee headquarters and put an end to Tecumseh's effort to form an Indian confederacy. The British had prohibited or had provided only limited aid to Tecumseh. Nevertheless, Americans on the frontier blamed the British for instigating the rebellion. So you're getting Tecumseh. Uh, he, of course, is trying to organize all the Native Americans to kind of go back and fight Americans, right? William Henry Harrison's able to stop this, but there is evidence that shows the British are giving them weapons. So we get what we call war hawks. A congressional election in 1810 had brought a group of new young Democratic Republicans to Congress, many of them from the frontier states, known as war hawks because of their eagerness for war with Britain. They quickly gained significant influence in the House of Representatives, led by Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. The war hawk members of Congress argued that war with Britain would be the only way to defend American honor, gain Canada, and destroy Indian resistance. So, war hawks, people that want to go to war with Britain. Declaration of war. British delays in meeting U.S. demands over neutral rights, combined with political pressures from the war hawks, finally persuaded Madison to declare war against Britain. Ironically, the British government by this time agreed to suspend its naval blockade. News of its decision reached the White House after Congress had declared war. So that sucks. They stopped the blockade, but too late. We declared war. Neither Congress nor the American people were united in the support for war. In Congress, Pennsylvania and Vermont joined the southern and western states to provide a slightly majority for war declaration. Voting against the war were most representatives from New York, New Jersey, and the rest of the states in New England. They didn't want to go to war. Election of 1812. A similar division of opinion was seen in the presidential election of 1812, in which Democratic Republicans strengthened in the South and West, overcame Federalist and anti-war Democratic Republican opposition to war North. Madison wins re-election, defeating DeWitt Clinton of New York. The candidate of Federalist and anti-war Democratic Republicans just was not a success. Opposition to the war. Americans who opposed the war viewed it as Mr. Madison's war, and the work of the war hawks in Congress. Most outspoken in the criticism were New England merchants, Federalist politicians, and quids or old Democratic Republicans. New England merchants were more opposed after the repeal of the Embargo Act, and they were making sizable profits from European war and viewed impressment as merely a minor inconvenience. So some people were okay with not going to war because they were benefiting from it, right? Britain and France, they wanted to trade with the U.S. They needed those resources. Both commercial interests and religious ties to Protestantism made them more sympathetic to Protestant British than to the Catholic French. A lot of people supported the British as well because they were Protestants. Federalist politicians viewed the war as a Democratic Republican scheme to conquer Canada and Florida. With the ultimate aim of increasing Democratic Republican voting strength for their part, the Quids criticized the war because it violated the classic Democratic Republican commitment to limited federal power and the maintenance of peace. And some people just wanted peace, and they felt like the government was gaining too much power. Military defeats and naval victories. Facing Britain's overwhelming naval power, Madison's military strategists based their hope in victory on number one, Napoleon continued to be success in Europe, and two, U.S. land campaign against Canada. So we thought that if we are successful in Canada, Napoleon continues being strong, that this would be beneficial for us in our war against Great Britain. Invasion of Canada. A poorly equipped American army initiated military action in 1812 by launching a three-part invasion of Canada. One force starting out from Detroit, another from Niagara, and the third in Lake Champlain. These and later forays in Canada were easily repulsed by the British defenders. An American raid and burning of government buildings in York, which is now Toronto, in 1813, only served to consider retaliation by the British, so we fail in Canada. Naval battles. The U.S. Navy achieved some notable victories due largely to superior shipbuilding and the valorous deeds of American sailors, including many free African Americans. In late 1812, the U.S. warship, the Constitution, raised American morale by defeating the sinking of a British ship off of Nova Scotia. American privateers, motivated by both patriotism and profit, captured numerous British merchant ships. Offset these gains was the success of the British Navy in establishing a blockade on the U.S. coast, which crippled trading and fishing. Probably the most important naval battle of the war was in 1813 on Lake Erie, with American Captain Oliver Hazard Perry declaring victory. We have met the enemy, and they are ours. This led to the way for General William Henry Harrison's victory at the Battle of Thames River, in which Tecumseh was killed. The next year, 1814, ships commanded by Thomas Mackindow defeated a British fleet on Lake Champlain. As a result, the British had to retreat and abandon their plan to invade New York and New England. So this is showing some of the success of our very young military. The Chesapeake Campaign. By the spring of 1814, the defeat of Germany in Europe enabled the British to increase their forces in North America. Defeat of Napoleon in Europe. In the summer of that year, a British army marched through the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., and set fire to the White House, the Capitol, and other buildings. The British also attempted to take Baltimore, but Fort McHenry held out after the night's bombardment, an event immortalized by Francis Scott Key in the words of the Star-Spangled Banner. Southern Campaign. Meanwhile, U.S. troops in the South were commanded by General Andrew Jackson, so you understand that this would lead to the rise of A.J. In March 1814, at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, in present-day Alabama, Jackson ended the power of an important British ally, the Creek Nation. The victory eliminated the Indians, and opened new lands to the white settlers. A British effort to control the Mississippi rivers is halted in New Orleans by Jackson leading a force of frontier soldiers, free Africans, and Creoles. The victory was impressive but also meaningless. The Battle of New Orleans was fought on January 8, 1815. 2 weeks after the treaty ending the war had been signed in the Treaty of Ghent, Belgium. So although Jackson didn't have a lot of success, the war was already over by that time. But he is remembered for his brutality against Native Americans as well as the success of that battle. The Treaty of Ghent. By 1814, the British were weary of war. Having fought Napoleon for more than a decade, they now faced the prospect of maintaining the peace in Europe. At the same time, Madison's government recognized that Americans would be unable to win a decisive victory. American peace commissioners traveled to Ghent, Belgium to discuss terms of peace with British diplomats on Christmas Eve 1814. An agreement was reached. The terms halted fighting, returned all conquered territory to pre-war claimant, and recognized the pre-war boundary between Canada and the United States. So this is a pointless war. Boundaries go back to the way that they were. The Treaty of Ghent, promptly ratified by Senate in 1815, said nothing at all about the grievances that led to the war. Britain made no concessions concerning impressment, blockades, or other maritime differences. Thus, the war ended in stalemate with no gain on either side. So it was a pointless war, the War of 1812. Just before the war ended in Hartford, so the Hartford Convention, just before the war ended, the New England states threatened to secede from the Union. Bitterly opposed to both the war and Democratic Republicans in Washington, radical Federalists in New England urged that the Constitution be amended as a last resort to secession can be voted upon. To consider these matters, a special convention was held at Hartford, Connecticut in 1814. Delegates from New England states rejected the radicals for secession, but to limit the growing power of the Democratic Republicans in the South and West, they adopted a number of proposals. One of them called for a two-thirds vote of both houses for any future declaration of war. Shortly after the convention dissolved, news came of both Jackson's victory at Orleans and also the Treaty of Ghent. These events ended criticism of the war, further weakened the Federalists by stamping them on as patriotic. So the Hartford Convention, there's word that they're going to, the Federalists want to go ahead, they actually want to secede, they're against the war, they're against the increasing power of the Democratic Republicans. So they have all these criticisms. However, when they published these criticisms, Jackson had just won the war and the Treaty of Ghent was signed. So this leads to the end of the party, the Federalist Party, because they're looked at as very unloyal. The war's legacy. From Madison's point of view, the war achieved none of its original aims. Nevertheless, it had a number of important consequences for future development of the American Republic. Here they are. Having survived 2 years of war with Britain, the United States gained respect, RESPECT, because they're military, I'm not going to sing. The United States accepted Canada as part of the British Empire, right? We lost that territory. We lost to the British in Canada, so we accept it. denounced for its toxic secession. The Federalist Party came to an end as a result of its treason of trying to secede. There was talk of nullification secession in New England instead of president that would later be used in the South, so it's not the first time, though, right? This is going to continue into the Civil War. Abandoned by the British, American Indians were forced to surrender. They were no longer getting weapons from the British. With the British naval blockade limiting European goods, U.S. factories were built, and Americans moved towards industrial and self-sufficiency. So this is very important. As a result of the blockade, we had to industrialize, right? Because we weren't getting these manufactured goods from Britain. War heroes such as William Henry Harrison and Andrew Jackson, they would become future presidents. And the feeling of nationalism, grew stronger, as did a belief that the future of the United States lay in the West and away from Europe. So very important that we're getting this rise of nationalism. So take a look at our questions. So remember, all you need to do is the analysis here. So here we go. We talked about Jefferson's presidency. He was able to defeat Aaron Burr, right? And more importantly, is he does, of course, abide by the demands of the Democratic Republicans, but he also gives in to some of the things and continues the Federalist policies, such as the national bank and paying the debt. Louisiana Purchase, very important to understand, is we purchase all of this land from Napoleon for less than $15 million because he wants to focus on the rebellions of Overture and as well as the war against British. We're concerned about the Mississippi River because the port of New Orleans, that's our access, right, to trade. We're looking at the Gulf of Mexico. We're looking at the Gulf as well in the southeast, right? We need access to that. So we do go ahead and we negotiate the French to purchase Louisiana land. However, there's a constitutional predicament: is that does the president have the power to do this? Jefferson, he is a strict interpretationist of the Constitution. However, he does make this exception. He says that if the Constitution doesn't say it, this deal is too good. We're going to go ahead and buy it anyways. Lewis and Clark, they end up going and kind of surveying the land in the westward up to Oregon. This is very important because it influences westward expansion, but also tells us about many of the resources and betters our relations with natives as well. John Marshall, he was the head of the Supreme Court during this time, and in the case, he also Jefferson's cousin, in the case of Marbury versus Madison, he established what we call judicial review, that the Supreme Court has the right to determine whether or not the decisions of the executive and legislative branch are constitutional. Jefferson goes ahead and he tries to get many of John Adams' Federalist appointments impeached, is not successful. However, the federal judges now know that they could be impeached and they are less partisan. Aaron Burr kills Alexander Hamilton, right? Aaron Burr is guilty of treason. As governor of New York, he actually tries to secede, tries to have the New England colonies secede from the Union, and then later on he tries to gain support from Spain and from Spain in order to rebel against the United States. Embargo of Chesapeake Leopold affair. So remember, during this time, the British and French are at war. We trade with both. However, the British keep impressing our ships, stealing our sailors. Both are stealing our cargo and taking over our ships. So the last straw was when a British ship would go ahead and attack an American warship. All right, this was the Chesapeake Leopold affair. As a result of this, things are getting very intense. We stopped trade, embargo of 1807, with both British and France because we want to prevent things such as the Chesapeake affair. So we get the Nonintercourse Act of 1809, and what this does is it states that because not being able to trade with Britain and France, and actually let me take a step back, this embargo act says not trade with anybody in the waters. Foreign trade is stopped, basically. This puts us into an economic recession. So in order to deal with this, James Madison becomes president, and he passes the Non-Intercourse Act. He just says we can't trade with just Britain and France, but we can trade with everybody else. But our economy is still in a lot of depression, so we pass Macon's Bill number 2, which says we will continue trade with Britain and France. However, whoever respects our shipping rights first, we will stop trading with the others. So if the French respect our rights, then we will stop trading with Britain. And Napoleon claims that he will respect our rights. We stop trading with Britain. He deceives us, and this leads to the War of 1812 because the British are unhappy of our boycott of goods and our embargo. Right, free season trade. That's what I mean by this. Also, the British keep supplying the Native Americans with weapons, and as Americans want to expand westward, the Native Americans are able to fight back because of these weapons. Warhawks. These are people that really want to go to war against Great Britain. So they declare the war. The nation's very divided. New England states are very much not wanting to go to war because they trade with France and Britain, right? And this is going to go ahead and prevent the economy from doing well, right? 1812, we get Madison, of course. He's still the president during this time. There's many people that oppose the war, but we are very successful in terms of our naval battles. We do fail against the invasion of Canada. I'm just going to skip through some of these. The Treaty of Ghent is signed. The Treaty of Ghent is signed because and Treaty of Ghent basically does nothing. It just stops the war. But there's all the boundaries go back to what it was before. Right. The Hartford Convention was going on during this time. This is when you're getting the Federalist Party that's kind of trying to unite, and they're upset with the war, right? So they're trying to just set the precedent that Congress, not the president, should have the right to declare war. That there needs to be a 2/3 vote on it. And also they state that the federal government is getting too power, so there's threat of them seceding or nullifying, choosing not to follow laws set by the government. However, the Hartford Convention, this is after Andrew Jackson's victory at the Battle of New Orleans. It's also after the Treaty of Ghent. So many people are happy the war is over. And once this Hartford Convention releases these documents that of their criticism against the Democratic Republicans, they are highly criticized, which leads to the end of it. War's legacy, I kind of just talked all of that. So going through your period 4 review sheet, this is where we are, age of Jefferson. These are the things that you want to make sure you know. Lewis and Clark went over that. Louisiana Purchase went over that. Monroe Doctrine under Monroe. Sorry, and I need to correct myself. It was Monroe after Madison. Monroe says that we should not be part of European affairs, that Europe should stay out of the Americas because Americans have the right to their sovereignty. At the same time, Americas will stay out of the affairs of Europe. War of 1812 against Great Britain, right? I kind of talked about this. So these are things that you want to make sure you know, things that you could use as no-card terms. And that is it.